What if I told you that modern Europe was not built by peace, trade, or innovation, but by war financed like a business? What if the Crusades were not just religious wars, but the first large-scale financial system designed to profit from destruction? Banks were born from blood. Taxes were perfected through warfare. Debt became a weapon more powerful than swords. And the system created nearly 1,000 years ago is still controlling your economy today. Stay till the end of this series, because once you understand how Europe learned to make war pay, you will never look at modern finance, global debt, or military spending the same way again. Before the Crusades, Europe was not the rich, powerful continent we imagine today. It was economically backward compared to the Islamic world and China. There were no strong banking systems, no standardized taxation, no organized war financing. Kings were constantly broke. Armies were temporary, unpaid, and unreliable. Wealth was locked in land, not money. Most rulers survived by extracting food and labor from peasants rather than managing real financial systems. War was expensive, chaotic, and often short because rulers simply ran out of resources. Then came the problem that changed everything. How do you send hundreds of thousands of soldiers across continents for years at a time, and pay for it? The Crusades forced Europe to confront a financial challenge it had never faced before. Soldiers needed weapons, food, transport, horses, ships, and wages. Armies could no longer rely on looting alone. Long-distance warfare required planning, accounting, taxation, and credit. This pressure didn't destroy Europe, it forced it to evolve. To fund crusading armies, European rulers began doing something revolutionary. They taxed at scale. Special crusade taxes were imposed on landowners, merchants, and even the church itself. For the first time, taxation became systematic, regular, and justified by ideology. War became the excuse to normalize financial extraction from society. At the same time, nobles who joined the Crusades sold or mortgaged their lands to raise cash. This created early property markets and liquidity. Land, once static, became a financial asset. Money started flowing faster than ever before. But the most important shift came when Europe realized something dangerous. War could be financed through debt. Italian merchant families, especially in Venice, Genoa, and Florence, stepped in. They didn't fight. They financed. They loaned money to kings, transported armies by sea, supplied weapons, and insured cargo. In return, they earned interest, trade privileges, and political power. This was the birth of war profiteering as a structured business model. By the end of the First Crusade, Europe was still violent and unstable, but financially transformed. War was no longer just destruction. It was becoming an industry. And once war becomes an industry, it never stops growing. As the Crusades continued, Europe learned a critical lesson: the longer the war, the more money it generated, for the right people. This realization reshaped everything. Banks evolved specifically to serve war. The Knights Templar created one of the world's first international banking networks. A crusader could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. This system reduced theft, increased mobility, and introduced standardized financial instruments. Letters of credit, safe transfers, and early audits were all developed because armies needed reliable money abroad. War forced efficiency. Governments also transformed. Kings began centralizing power not for justice, but for revenue. Bureaucracies expanded to track taxes, debts, and military spending. Accounting systems improved. Records were kept. Budgets were planned. War required management, and management required finance. The church, too, became a financial giant. It collected donations, sold indulgences, and redirected enormous wealth toward military campaigns. Religion became the marketing strategy. Finance was the engine underneath. People believed they were funding salvation, but in reality, they were fueling Europe's first permanent war economy. Merchants thrived. Trade routes expanded under military protection. Arms manufacturers grew rich. Shipbuilders scaled operations. Supply chains formed. Entire cities depended on war contracts. For the first time, peace became economically inconvenient. The biggest change was psychological. Europe stopped seeing war as a desperate last resort. War became an investment. Borrow now, conquer later, repay with taxes and plunder. This logic didn't disappear when the Crusades ended, it became embedded in European governance. By the later Crusades, Europe had mastered something terrifyingly modern: deficit spending for war. Rulers spent money they didn't have, promising future revenue. This model laid the foundation for national debt, central banking, and military-industrial systems that dominate the modern world. The Crusades eventually failed militarily, but financially, they were a massive success. Europe emerged stronger, richer, and more organized than ever before. Not despite war, but because it learned how to monetize it. And this is where the story becomes even more dangerous. Because once Europe discovered how to turn war into a permanent economic engine, it never looked back. The Crusades didn't just finance armies, they invented a financial revolution. By the late 12th century, European rulers had discovered the dangerous but incredibly effective power of debt-financed warfare. Kings borrowed heavily from merchants, promising repayment through taxes, spoils of war, and church tithes. This was the birth of state debt, the precursor to modern national debt. But debt alone couldn't work without a system to manage it. Enter the Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Florence. Merchants weren't just lenders, they became bankers, accountants, and financiers of war. They developed tools we still use today: letters of credit, bonds, auditing systems, and risk management. If a king defaulted, or died mid-campaign, the debt was transferred to heirs or enforced by church law. Money became portable, reliable, and international. The Knights Templar accelerated this transformation. Their network allowed crusaders to deposit cash in one city and withdraw it thousands of miles away. Early forms of checks, promissory notes, and international transfers emerged. Suddenly, Europe had a financial infrastructure that could move wealth across continents with unprecedented speed. Wars, which once drained resources, now created wealth for those who controlled finance. Italian merchants and bankers grew richer than kings, gaining political influence that rivaled monarchies. By financing war, they controlled it, and by controlling war, they controlled Europe's destiny. The psychological shift was even more profound. The logic of debt-financed war made rulers think like CEOs. Conquest became a financial project: plan, invest, execute, profit. Finance became inseparable from power. And as Europe returned from the Holy Lands, carrying not just relics but massive debts and financial knowledge, a new question emerged: if war could be monetized, why stop there? The financial lessons of the Crusades didn't stay in Europe. They traveled with merchants, bankers, and rulers into the wider world. By the 15th century, these systems of war finance were the backbone of European colonial expansion. Spain, Portugal, France, and England borrowed massive sums to fund overseas expeditions. Loans were backed not by abstract promises, but by gold, land, and eventually entire colonies. The logic of the Crusades was exported: conquest financed by debt, profit guaranteed through extraction. Trading companies, like the British and Dutch East India Companies, were effectively private armies financed through shareholder investment. They were the corporate descendants of Italian bankers who financed crusader armies. This period also saw the rise of permanent standing armies funded by taxation and loans. No longer were armies temporary or mercenary-based, now they were long-term, professional, and expensive. States learned to centralize power, enforce taxes efficiently, and manage national finances like a war corporation. The war economy also reshaped society. Merchants and financiers became power brokers. Cities that specialized in arms, shipbuilding, and logistics grew wealthy. Peasants and commoners funded wars through taxes, often without realizing they were investing in a system that enriched the elite. Europe had created a self-perpetuating cycle: war creates finance, finance funds more war, and society becomes dependent on both. By the end of this period, Europe's financial and military dominance was no longer accidental. It was carefully built over centuries of experimentation during the Crusades. The stage was set for modern Europe's global supremacy, powered by the same financial tools invented to fight holy wars. And here's the crucial lesson: The mechanisms that allowed kings and merchants to profit from medieval wars didn't vanish, they evolved. Every bond, every national debt, every war-funded infrastructure project in Europe today traces its roots back to the Crusades. The modern military-industrial complex, central banks, and even global debt markets are the distant descendants of a system born in blood and finance. If you like, I can continue with chapters 5 to 10, where we fully connect the Crusades' war economy to modern Europe, industrialization, global trade, and even today's financial military systems, ending with a strong, inspiring message that hooks the viewer until the very last minute. The financial tools honed during the Crusades didn't remain confined to wars alone. They became the backbone of Europe's emerging economic system. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was experiencing its first waves of industrialization. Trade networks, manufacturing hubs, and banking institutions all followed patterns created for war financing. Weapons production, shipbuilding, and logistics became industrialized long before the Industrial Revolution officially began. Cities that once thrived by funding crusades now thrived by producing guns, cannons, and ships for state armies. European rulers applied the same logic: invest in production today, reap profit and power tomorrow. Debt continued to be a tool of expansion. Governments borrowed heavily to fund wars and infrastructure. Investors, both local and international, financed everything from fortified cities to colonial fleets. The system was no longer just about survival. It was about creating sustainable wealth through militarized finance. Even ordinary citizens were now integrated into the financial machine. Taxes, loans, and trade levies funded state armies while simultaneously fueling economic growth. The lessons from the Crusades were clear: finance creates power, and power can create more finance. Europe was no longer a land of feudal chaos. It was becoming a continent where money and war were inseparable. With the financial and industrial tools in place, Europe looked outward. Colonization was essentially an extension of the Crusade-era financial model: conquer, extract, and profit. Spain and Portugal leveraged gold, silver, and other resources from the Americas to finance further military campaigns and domestic growth. The Dutch and British East India Companies were private armies in corporate form. Investors financed expeditions with the expectation of returns from trade, plunder, or taxation. Cities like Amsterdam, London, and Lisbon thrived, turning European finance into a global powerhouse. What began as regional warfare in the Holy Land had become a global financial and military strategy. Wars, colonies, and trade routes were all intertwined with debt, investment, and financial oversight. And much like the Crusades, ordinary populations funded these endeavors through taxes and labor, often unaware that they were part of a system designed to benefit a small elite. The key innovation was scale. Medieval wars were local or regional. Colonial finance made Europe a global economic machine, capable of projecting both military and financial power across continents. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the war finance system reached a new level of sophistication. Industrialization allowed armies to grow larger and more permanent. Governments became experts in raising capital, issuing bonds, and managing national debt to support wars on an unprecedented scale. The logic remained unchanged from the Crusades. War requires money, money can be borrowed, and those who manage it gain influence. Military contractors, arms manufacturers, and financiers thrived, creating the earliest versions of what we now call the military-industrial complex. Wars became predictable economic cycles. Each conflict could stimulate innovation, infrastructure, and wealth, if managed properly. Europe learned how to profit from war while simultaneously consolidating political and financial power. The system became self-perpetuating. This synergy between finance and military might explain why Europe dominated the world during the colonial era. The lessons of the Crusades, debt, credit, logistics, taxation, and profit, were applied on a global stage, allowing a small continent to control vast empires. The 20th century brought world wars, but the financial principles were the same. National debt skyrocketed, war bonds became tools to fund massive campaigns, and the relationship between money and military power reached global proportions. Central banks, international finance, and industrial military conglomerates trace their DNA back to Crusade-era innovations. The idea that war could be financed, monetized, and leveraged to create long-term economic growth remains central to modern geopolitics. Even today, military budgets, defense contracts, and government debt echo the same strategies European kings and merchants used 800 years ago. The Crusades didn't just shape medieval Europe, they created the blueprint for every modern war economy. In the 21st century, we see the ultimate evolution of the Crusade-inspired financial system. Global military spending, international debt markets, and multinational corporations operate on principles remarkably similar to those of medieval financiers. Wars, conflicts, and defense initiatives are funded through complex financial instruments, and investors, institutions, and governments all profit from them. Ordinary taxpayers unknowingly continue the tradition, funding defense budgets that, while essential, are also deeply intertwined with economic interests. The key insight is that war and finance are inseparable. The same logic that allowed European merchants to profit from the Crusades now drives the modern global economy: risk, leverage, and strategic investment. Understanding this lineage gives perspective not only on history, but on our modern financial world. The Crusades were not merely a religious or military phenomenon, they were the blueprint for Europe's modern financial systems. Debt, banking, taxation, investment, and the monetization of war all began during this era. By learning how to finance conflict, Europe created a war economy that allowed it to dominate the globe. The lesson is both inspiring and cautionary. Innovation, organization, and financial foresight can transform societies, but power concentrated in a few hands, amplified by war, also has consequences. Modern finance and global economics are the heirs of this system, meaning every dollar we invest, borrow, or spend is part of a continuum that stretches back centuries. In the end, the story of the Crusades teaches us that finance shapes history as much as swords do. Understanding this allows us to see the hidden forces behind modern economics, recognize the origins of global power structures, and make smarter, more informed decisions about money, governance, and strategy. Europe's war economy may have begun with crusaders and knights, but its lessons are for all of us, today, in every financial decision we make. The past is not gone, it's embedded in every bond, every investment, and every war-funded infrastructure project in our world. And now, having seen the rise of Europe's financial empire from blood and debt, you realize that history is finance, and finance is history. If the Crusades taught Europe anything, it was that war could be systematized, monetized, and institutionalized. The systems created during those centuries, debt financing, banking networks, taxation for war, and profit-driven logistics, didn't disappear when the last crusader returned home. They evolved, spread, and became the foundation for modern financial empires, industrialized economies, and globalized trade networks. Today, whether we are talking about national debt, global investment markets, or defense contracts, the fingerprints of the Crusades are everywhere. The principle is the same: leverage capital to create power, manage risk to sustain growth, and turn conflict, or competition, into opportunity. Corporations, governments, and even entire economies operate on this blueprint. But there's a deeper lesson here: the combination of vision, risk, and finance can transform civilizations. The Crusaders didn't invent the world, but their wars forced Europe to invent the systems that would eventually allow it to dominate globally. Banking, debt, credit, and logistics were not abstract concepts, they were tools forged under the pressure of survival, expansion, and ambition. This story is both a warning and an inspiration. Finance is not neutral. Money is power. And those who understand its history and mechanisms can shape the world, or be shaped by it. The Crusades remind us that the economy, like history, is built not by accident, but by design. So, as we look at modern finance, ask yourself, how much of what we see today, national budgets, global debt, corporate empires, traces back to lessons learned on battlefields 900 years ago? The answer is simple: almost everything. And in understanding that, we gain not only perspective on the past but insight into the forces shaping our future. The legacy of the Crusades is not just war, it is the blueprint of a war economy that powers civilizations, drives innovation, and reshapes societies. And now that you know the story, you can see the hidden threads that connect past, present, and future. History is more than dates and battles. History is finance. History is power. And the world, as we know it today, was built on both. From the dust of the Holy Lands to the skyscrapers of modern cities, the story of Europe's war economy is still alive in every bank, every investment, and every decision that shapes nations. Understanding this history doesn't just tell us where we came from, it teaches us how to navigate the financial and political world of today. Remember, finance is more than money, it is the ultimate force that builds empires, wages wars, and shapes the course of human history. Study it, respect it, and maybe, just maybe, you can master it too.